Hello and welcome everyone to today's sample MBA faculty lecture. We have a great diverse audience signed up and a very interactive session with one of our top faculty members. So thank you for taking the next hour to join us today. Just to make sure quickly before we get started, is the audio working for everyone? If you could just type yes into the chat box if you can hear me okay. See, just waiting. Okay. Sam, can you hear me? Oh, yes. Okay, perfect. So just to quickly introduce myself, my name is Misha Ragona, and I'm one of the recruitment and admission managers for the Oxford MBA. I'm also joined by my colleague, Samantha White, who is the marketing manager on our team, and she'll be helping moderate the session.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today.
So just as you did before on the chat box, please feel free to use that throughout the session to ask questions that are relevant to the lecture. There might also be an opportunity for some audio discussion. Not to worry, there won't be a webcam component. So if you're tuning in your pajamas, that's quite okay. Also, if you do have another device handy, it might be useful to access the poll link that will be shared by Michael, and Sam will also include that into the chat. There's an interactive poll that you can access, and sometimes it's helpful to have on another device so that you can continue to watch the webinar. So for the session titled today, Leading with Confidence in an Age of Disruption, How to Harness the Power of Doubt, I'm honored to introduce Michael Smets, Professor of Management here at Saïd Business School. Michael is a graduate of Oxford Saïd himself. After some time away, he rejoined the faculty in 2013. He leads our research cluster on professional service firms and advises some of the world's leading law, accounting, and consulting firms. He was ranked among the top 40 under 40 MBA professors in the world, and last year, Thinkers 50 included Michael in their radar list of management scholars to watch, considering him the up-and-coming voice in leadership. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Michael to kickstart the session.
Thank you very much, Misha, and a very, very warm welcome from me as well. It's great to have so many of you in this session. It's great that so many of you still find the opportunity to think about developing yourself in the situation we currently lead in. We definitely need a new generation of leaders who have to lead the confidence to lead in an age of disruption. So it's my great pleasure today to give you a little bit of a taste of what it would be like in the MBA classroom. Of course, we would all love to be together face to face, and we hope that from September we will have the opportunity to again to have these conversations and discussions face to face. Nonetheless, we've tried to make this as interactive as possible. So as you see at the bottom of the slide, we will use a polling software called Poll Everywhere. So as Misha has already mentioned, if you have either a second device handy or maybe even just open a second browser tab on your browser, please go to www.pollev.com/Smets, and by the time we get to the relevant slides, there will be questions appearing, and I'm very much looking forward to your views, given what a wonderfully diverse audience we have, both in terms of professional background, but also geography and experience you bring. So I'm very much looking forward to learning with you over the next hour. As has been mentioned before, this should be as interactive as possible. So please, if you have questions, if you have comments, if you want to contribute, please use the chat box. I have a separate screen here in front of me as well. I will keep an eye on that, but I also know that Misha and Sam will be keeping a close eye on your contributions, so we can hear your views too. Now, until not so long ago, we were convinced that we were living in an age of disruption. All the things, the socio-technical, political upheavals that we were facing, we're rethinking the future of work, the gig economy, the way we operate was completely transformed. The role of artificial intelligence, the interaction of humans and machines, questioned how we go about our daily lives, the role of cryptocurrencies, blockchain, similar things like that, or the simple question of what do we actually still recognize as true in today's day and age. And we thought almost like, how much worse could it possibly get? And then we got an answer in the coronavirus. If we're thinking about situations in which we lead in an age of disruption, and especially uncertainty and ambiguity, I think with most commentators agree that rarely ever in the history of mankind has there been a situation in which things were more uncertain than they are at the moment. So how do we lead in these moments of uncertainty? It's one of the great paradoxes of leadership of our times that people look to us for answers, for guidance, for confidence, when on the other hand, the world gives us fewer and fewer of those answers, and it is increasingly difficult for us to know and to develop that confidence. So what I would like to know from you initially, thinking about this question, and I see many of you have already made it to the polling website. If I could ask you to go there, you will see on the slide again across the top the URL where you can share your views, but you can also see some of the words that some of your peers have already shared. And as you've probably guessed, the larger the word, the more people have submitted the very, very same word. So we have clearly synonyms. There's a lot of anxiety or people feeling anxious, but there's also, as you can see, some apprehensiveness and some excitement about that. Some doubt, someone feels thrill, nervousness. Others may feel paralyzed. They feel the sense of responsibility in this particular situation. Okay, take a look. Keep them coming, those comments, those words, and please also keep the website open. We will reuse it later on. But I would like to invite your commentary. If you want to type into the chat box, is this what we expected to see from a group like this? Is this a surprise? How do we feel about this kind of vocabulary of words that we currently see on screen in front of us? Just type your views into the chat box and keep a close eye on how your classmates feel about these situations of high stakes, high uncertainty decisions.
We're starting to get a few coming through now. Basically,
Okay.
A lot of people are saying the same things, which is great to see that everyone's on the same page, no matter where we are in the world. So a lot of people are saying it's as expected, and they're actually pleased to see that they're not alone. Some people saying these are very human responses, saying that it's a really a good representation of a broad spectrum of feelings. Really nice comment from someone saying that it's understandable there's feelings of anxiety, but it's a worry that maybe we aren't prepared or we aren't conditioned for these scenarios, which is a really good point, Matthew. Some people saying it's a little bit disconcerting. Lots of people coming through saying it's expected and it's understandable, which is great to see. So many people thinking the same things.
Yeah. And I like Artyom's comment that actually, yes, it is as expected because it's very human. Yes, we're all human making those decisions, and we feel the full range of human emotion. The key question then is, and the question that naturally follows, how comfortable are you using these words in your organizations, or how often do you hear those words from the leaders that maybe you work with, you report to? If this is human, shouldn't we feel much more comfortable using those words? And typically what we hear more often than not is, well, that would be career suicide to talk about these things. But actually it may not be. And the question is, how can we avoid this stigma of feeling or looking unprepared, which people might actually take as a sign of weakness, when really understanding when we're not fully prepared to make a big decision should be a sign of strength, because it drives positive behaviors to actually prepare ourselves better to make those kind of decisions. And in fact, just to share with you, you're genuinely not alone. And there are people who should be much more prepared for these situations than you, who feel exactly the same. So the word cloud you're currently seeing on screen is the very same exercise done with a group of corporate CEOs with a significant amount of tenure. When big decisions are being made, people are still feeling in very, very similar ways. Yes, because we are human. So very quickly, we've already accomplished a couple of things for ourselves. First, we've given ourselves an incredibly broad vocabulary to think about our emotions and decision-making, and we have acknowledged that we have them. For a long time, the management literature has tried to kind of do away with them, eliminate emotions from decision-making. They were considered something bad, but rather we want to think about, okay, how can we actually leverage them? How can we use them to understand our decision-making better and, in fact, make better decisions? Second, we've realized that there's actually a channel for much deeper human connection if we start to acknowledge these emotions. Typically, when we build relationships, when we work with people in our professional environments, very often we make connections, have conversations around expertise. But naturally, if someone is more expert than somebody else, we're not really seeing eye to eye. There is an information asymmetry. Whereas if we can start to acknowledge these emotions, we can actually start having conversations around them and build connection on a much more human level. Third, we've also started to equip ourselves a bit better to manage our own mental well-being and our own mental health. Really interesting conversation I had not so long ago with a really big law firm. Talked to their most senior partners. We had the same conversation we are having right now, and I asked them, how often do you use these words? They looked at me a little bit baffled and said, well, we have open plan offices. We don't need to describe how we feel because our associates can see how we feel. And then it took them a while to realize that actually, if everyone can see how senior leaders are really feeling, but they also realize that those senior leaders are too afraid to acknowledge those emotions, what does that do for the corporate culture that you're building? And so they started to realize that to build their own personal resilience, but also to make their workplace much healthier for everyone involved, they had to become much more comfortable to actually articulate and spell out the emotions that they associate with their decision making. So how did we come up with the way that we think about emotions and decision making? Several years back, we started a big research project to understand what it takes to run a global corporation in the 21st century. We teamed up with Heidrick & Struggles and produced a report that we called the CEO report. So we reached out to over 150 corporate CEOs from around the world who collectively have 880 years of experience, not just in business, but 880 years of experience as CEO, on average 6.5 years. They're responsible for an average 46,000 employees and $14 billion of revenues, so there are some fairly household names in there. To give you some impression of the caliber of people we spoke to, the image shows you the panel that launched the report at the World Economic Forum in Davos. The gentleman with the microphone is Matthew Bishop, the international editor of The Economist. Eileen Gordon is the CEO of Ingredion. Arne Sorensen is the CEO of Marriott Hotels. And Klaus Kleinfeld was formerly the CEO of Siemens and then Alcoa. And most recently, he's been tasked with building NEOM, the new artificial intelligence super city in Saudi Arabia. What is actually more noticeable about this report, though, than the elite nature of the respondents is how we engage them. I'm sure you're all familiar with big CEO reports that are being published by PwC, IBM, and other sources, but they are just that, surveys. And so what we did is we reached out deliberately to CEOs from around the globe to make it very comprehensive in terms of industry, in terms of region, but we also made it deeply personal. On average, we sat down for 1 hour face-to-face with each of those CEOs to talk in depth about what it takes to do their job. And in exchange, we reassured them of complete anonymity. The names I've just mentioned, they've authorized us to mention their names in association with the report. I will share some data from the report, but I won't tell you who said what. And that protection of anonymity, this ability to speak freely and articulate with honesty what is great about the job of a CEO, but also what's sometimes really hard about the job of the CEO, really produced some of the surprises in our report. And one of them was the question about how CEOs feel about doubt. So we asked them, what's the hardest decision you've ever had to make? We would get a very illustrative example. We would ask CEOs how they made that decision, and we would get a textbook answer of a decision-making heuristic. And then very casually, we asked them, do you ever doubt yourself? And we were very surprised when 71% of our respondents said yes. And even more surprisingly, not only did they admit to doubting themselves, they almost celebrated it. A level of professional doubt should be the quality of any good leader, said one of them. In fact, if you don't doubt yourself in a constructive, positive way, you are borderline dangerous for your company. Doubt for the win. Beyond that, there were another 10% of our respondents who said they don't doubt themselves, but then went to great length to explain to us how they work through their doubts. And then there were 19% of those participants who said they don't doubt themselves, and we can speak about those as well. But in a world where predominantly we talk about executive hubris, this notorious overconfidence amongst executive leaders, it was definitely a surprise to find such a high percentage of people who admit to doubt, and as I said, such a positive attitude towards it. We've since replicated this study with public servants, leaders in the cultural sector, and that percentage is even higher, well over 90% of top-level leaders, directors, CEOs admitting to doubting themselves and finding this positive. So how do executives think about doubt? And the way we came to think about it was doubts are for executives what nerves are for elite athletes. If we can harness them, if we can turn them into a force for good, they give us greater insight, they give us greater energy, they actually help us make better decisions. In the end, one of the people who are probably most notoriously associated with a tremendous amount of confidence said, we all have self-doubt. You don't deny it, but you also don't capitulate to it. You embrace it, because that doubt is the source of that confidence. That was Kobe Bryant. And so to be very clear, when I asked you the initial question for the poll, we're not suggesting that corporate CEOs are continuously doubting themselves. But what is interesting is this paradox that they explain to us, that they say, well, the better I doubt myself, the more confidence I have in my decision, and the greater my conviction when I communicate that decision. So doubt, if handled well, breeds confidence, builds conviction. And that's the question, how can we use the initial emotions, whether they mean nervousness or doubt and anxiety or all those things that you mentioned in this initial word cloud, how can we use those to actually drive better decision making, build more confidence, and build more personal resilience and confidence to lead in an age of ambiguity and an age of disruption. So how are we thinking about doubt? Well, very simply, when we think about this framework, the power of doubt, we come to think of doubt as somewhere on a continuum between not knowing and knowing. Because as one of the CEOs in our sample said, well, actually, chasing certainty is futile. Instead, you must find comfort in the discomfort of uncertainty. And personally, I feel that is definitely true of the situation we're currently living in. Whether it is your personal circumstances, you're self-isolating at home, you're under lockdown, your work life or your personal life has been turned upside down, somehow we have to find this comfort in the discomfort of uncertainty. The problem is that sense of comfort is very different to this notion of knowledge. So yes, doubt exists somewhere on this continuum between not knowing and knowing. If we were all knowing, there would be no place for doubt. Very, very crudely put. But then, how do we relate to that lack of knowledge? And just borrowing words from the CEOs in our study, one of them said, look, I've taken myself out of the second guessing game because it will drive you crazy. An example of this heroic leadership when the going gets tough, the tough get going, when no one knows what's going on, I will take you somewhere. So we have the sense of very fearless leadership. But on the other hand, as we've also seen in your responses, there is a level of anxiety. Some of them say, well, it's never black and white. There is an anxiety, which in a way almost gives you a bit more clarity, pointing to the silver lining that some of those emotions that we find negative or that are commonly described as negative, there is actually something positive in there if we manage to harness that positivity. And just to be very clear, this is not to downplay in any way that, of course, high levels of anxiety are a mental health problem for which people need to seek help. But the question is, how do we protect ourselves against these levels of anxiety spiraling so high that it becomes a genuine mental health issue? And how do we ensure that we're more on the edge of seeing that little bit more clarity? So as you can see, what we've done here is basically we build up this stylized 2x2 matrix, which we call the landscape of doubt. What's your level of knowledge? And how do you emotionally relate to that? And so what I would ask you to do is think about the situation you had in mind when you logged that emotion earlier in the poll. What was it that underpinned that emotion? Were you feeling anxious because you didn't know and you didn't know what to do? Maybe you felt anxious because you did know and actually you started to realize that this problem is far more complex than you originally had anticipated. Were you fearless because you knew the answer? Or maybe you were fearless because no one knew the answer and you felt you could really make a difference. And so if I could invite you back again to the Poll Everywhere website, I hope you still have it open somewhere, and think about the situation that evoked this emotion you submitted earlier, and then just tap the screen to indicate where you think it fits. And there are no right or wrong answers. It's just a reflective tool for you to help understand your decision-making situations. And while your responses come in, I'll take a quick look at the chat and what other contributions we've had coming in so you don't miss any of your nuggets.
Can you see the chat box okay, Michael?
Yes, thank you. And there are a couple of really fascinating comments here, so thank you very much for those. And it's interesting that, again, this notion of like the emotions skew negative. And again, that's something I'm really keen to get across, that yes, let's think of these emotions as uncomfortable. But the question is, how can we control these emotions and leverage them for something positive, rather than allow these emotions to control us and be something negative? Yes, also the point that organizations are increasingly moving to encouraging people to mention those words, to articulate emotions more authentically. But unfortunately, I think the inconvenient truth also is that many organizations are not yet very far along that line. So if you are working for one of these organizations, or if you're even one of those leaders who encourages team members to speak openly about emotions, then congratulations. This is really a special place to be. But what we also want to think about is, okay, for those who are not yet in organizations like this, how can we still have those conversations without fearing any kind of stigma or repercussion? There's also one question about, do those doubting CEOs demonstrate their doubt or keep it to themselves? Now that, I think, is obviously a very important question. And I would say that in the anonymity of the interview setting, CEOs were much more comfortable saying that. And they're also very clear that, again, they doubt themselves, and they may share that with an inner circle, a team. We will now spend a few minutes thinking about who we want to have those kinds of conversations with. But then they make their decision, they build their confidence, and then step out in front of the organization with the conviction that they have built through this doubting process. So again, we're not saying you're likely, we're not even advising that senior leaders step out in front of their troops once they've made the decision, announcing that they doubt themselves, but they should process these doubts so they arrive at a better decision. Right, in the meantime, we've had a very, very rich picture emerge on our screen. And again, the quick invitation, is this what we would have expected? Are there any surprises? Very quick reflections now that you've looked at this picture for a while. I'll keep an eye on the chat box again. People are starting to think about the intersection with culture and national culture, organizational culture, absolutely. And that is important. Good. Great. So yes, in terms of national culture, one of the other big surprises of our study was that even though we tried to get as global a sample as possible, that level of doubt remained very high. People experience the same kind of emotions, but of course, the way in which we can process them is very, very different. Some people can be more humorous, more self-deprecating about a lack of knowledge. In other cultures, this would count as a loss of face and would actually be very detrimental to a personal career. But we can see, obviously, there is a large and very dense cluster of people who sit in this kind of not knowing, more anxious quadrant, lots of people there. And then the rest is relatively evenly spread out. Interestingly, thinking more about, there are quite a few people in this kind of not knowing, fearless quadrant. And now we want to understand, okay, what is it about these different situations that characterize these four quadrants, but especially how can we make them productive, and how do we respond to these different situations in different ways? Now, if we're perfectly honest with ourselves, most likely in moments of doubt or generally situations of, let's call them vulnerability, we go to the same people. I encourage you to think about in a moment that is really one of those more vulnerable, let's call them darker moments. How many people are there you would really turn to and open up to in terms of, I really don't know what to do here at this moment? There are typically not that many. And those very few are more likely than not very similar to us. It's called homophily. Birds of a feather flock together. But the conversations that these people can offer to us are not necessarily the conversations we need in each of those four different quadrants. So once you've done this exercise, once you've started to acknowledge your emotions, once you've started to acknowledge why it is that you feel about a particular situation in a particular way, you can then be much more deliberate and much more proactive to seek to curate certain conversations that actually help you in this particular situation. So this landscape of doubt is really a tool to make you more reflective about the different decision-making scenarios you face. So what we want to think about for each of those quadrants, okay, what are actually the key risks, and especially, of course, the key decision-making risks in these 4 different situations? In short, what could possibly go wrong? Then we should ask ourselves, okay, what can we do to make doubt generative and boost our confidence to have more compelling conversations and make better decisions? So basically the question is, how do we move out from these edges of that disc so we don't fall off the edge, but we move closer to that productive center? But also the question is, who can help us with that? What are the sources of support we rely on both professionally and personally? Let's take a quick look. Let's start with maybe what is the more intuitive quadrant. We feel anxious because we don't know. If you just want to quickly type into the chat again, what's the key decision-making risk? What could possibly go wrong when we don't know and it makes us anxious? And then you can already start thinking a little bit further about what could we do about it and what is that kind of positive outcome we are aiming for. Okay, people are obviously spot on very, very quickly. It may be that we fear that we become ridiculed if we make a decision, so overall we look at a risk of paralysis. We're just not making any decisions at all. So as one of the CEOs in our study put it, well, you need this honest humility about what are you actually capable of knowing? And especially in the current situation in the pandemic where everyone was quick to acknowledge, look, we don't actually know how this virus behaves. We needed this humility to say, look, it's not just that I don't know, but it is currently impossible to know with any certainty about what is going to happen next. And that is already a very difficult admission to make for most leaders, but then you need to retain you may think about, okay, what are the sources you learn from? What are the sources you consume? What would build your awareness? Who would you seek to have conversations with? Again, if you think about the situation you had in mind when you dropped your pin on this particular quadrant and you wanted help with that particular situation, who would be in your corner, so to speak, and lend you support? Again, you can reflect or share in the chat, and I will pick them up as they come through. But it was really interesting when we talked to the CEOs that in an age of big data and data analytics, they were often referring to fairly low-tech solutions. They said, look, I talked to the person next to me on a long-haul flight, I talked to the taxi driver, hotel staff, my children, my children's friends, not because they can give me the answer, but because they can give me a completely unencumbered view of how to think about it. They have nothing to lose, they have no skin in the game, they don't need to think about what I would possibly want to hear. They can completely blow my mind and build new awareness of how I should think about these different things. And yes, that is a role. People who have seen a similar scenario, Bart says, or we want to think about experts. Yeah, people who can broaden our horizon and drive this kind of continuous learning that suspends us this little bit closer to that productive center of that framework, where we're caught between the anxiety of inaction, but maybe also the fearlessness or recklessness, and we gain the ability to proceed, but maybe proceed with caution. The key here, though, is that the CEOs in our study were very, very clear that it's often not the knowing, but it is the anxiety that drives their behavior. They're very clear that there are lots of things they don't know a lot about, and they're perfectly fine with that. They say, but when I get this knotty feeling in my tummy, I get this unease, that's the signal for me that this is really something I should know more about. And that's what inspires my learning. And that's why it's so important to be in touch and to acknowledge the emotions around your decision making. Okay, thanks for your chat. Yes, people say that there is also a lot of not knowing about what will happen with the start of the MBA year. And I guess that's a question that's open, whether it's face-to-face or online, that you will face with any business school. But we can think about how we can use a framework like this to work through some of those different scenarios. So one example, and something, apologies if I missed it, there were so many comments that scrolled through very quickly. We talk about, well, we can build confidence by enhancing our knowledge, but of course we could also reduce people's anxiety and the risk of paralysis by changing how people feel about making mistakes, how they feel about not knowing. Think about Amy Edmondson's concept of psychological safety, for instance. What is the culture in our organization that we say, right, we do not have full knowledge, but we are making a decision on the best knowledge available at this time. And one exemplar I really like in this field, and it's not a current leader, but it's William McKnight, who was the chairman of 3M at the middle of the last century, actually. So while we all know of 3M as an incredibly innovative company, invented the Post-it, things like that, he was actually the forefather who led the foundations for all of this. Because when he wrote his management manifest, he said, well, if we're serious about scaling, we need to be serious about delegating decisions to our staff. And when we're serious about delegating decisions to staff, we also need to get serious about accepting their mistakes. And he said, I am convinced that any staff member who fails with the best intention of the company at heart will still generate more value than any manager trying to prescribe to him or her how to go about their job. So this notion that about, okay, if we make decisions through a good decision-making process, we should take away people's anxiety and we should praise them for that, even though with hindsight at some point the decision may turn out to be wrong. If we evaluate decisions purely by the outcome, we're actually running the risk that we may consider some decisions very good, very clever, but in the end it was really sheer dumb luck that we got it right. So we need to think about decision-making processes rather than outcomes. Okay, let's move on and think about that quadrant on the bottom right, which is a little bit less intuitive. And again, if you want to use the chat function and share both what could possibly go wrong, what is the risk, but also what is the different kind of conversation we would want to have in this quadrant rather than the first one. So the question is, do we just need to have conversations that address our anxiety, or are somehow our conversations different, whether we're anxious because we don't know or whether we are anxious because we do know? Okay, Sam says, yes, it's the fear of being judged for our choices that generates the anxiety. We can have a similar sense of paralysis. Yes, Christine says, but this time because of over-information rather than the lack of information. Harriet says, how do we trust our judgment? Yes, absolutely good. It's the need for validation, Thomas says. That's spot on. Yes, and we need this kind of self-assurance. Okay, lovely. I would love to have this conversation with you in class next year, but you're absolutely spot on. There's this somewhat irrational angst that we do know what the right decision is, but somehow we lack the confidence to push the button and go ahead with it. And very often that might be a question of information overload, or then the question of, well, the more you know, the more you know you don't know. So for those people, they work their way all the way from not knowing to knowing, and once they actually have the full knowledge to make the decision to say, well, that idea that you're crystal clear at those moments, that's an artificial construct. If you're that clear, you've probably missed something, and you find yourself all the way back at the not knowing end of things, redoing your work. So the risk is that suddenly we actually know what the right thing to do is. But either we risk or we fear of being judged, we're starting to understand how difficult it will be to implement that decision. And in the end, we might end up talking ourselves out of a perfectly good and competent decision. So as some of you have already said, yes, sorry, also just spotting Simona saying the more you know, the more questions you may have. And that is why here we need validation. I don't need more information necessarily, but I need to have a conversation about, okay, tell me I'm not crazy. Is this a good idea? Let's kick the tires on this particular decision. And as some of you have also mentioned, you will probably want to talk to people who've done this before. So this is where peer mentoring and benchmarking become really, really important. As the participants in our study said, well, that's why we go to Davos. That's why we go to the World Economic Forum. As a CEO, it's very lonely at the top, but at least here we can be lonely together. And actually, each and every one of our research interviews always ends with the same question. What question should we have asked, but we didn't? What do you want to know from this study? Guess what 150 CEOs asked. What did the others say? Am I normal? Can I validate my perception of leadership and of the world? And so one example here, think about the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, for instance, and especially their educational arm. They run an incredibly rigorous regime for validation. We know of other philanthropic donors who are kind of much more willing to just sprinkle their wealth around, but they really, even though they may feel they know where their money could be best used, they don't just rely on their own sense of knowledge, but they have their intuition validated very carefully before they disperse any money. Now that brings us to the third quadrant, then the top right. We know and we're fearless, and surely this must be decision-making nirvana, the best possible outcome. What do we think could go wrong there? And again, how do we protect ourselves against those decision-making risks? Hubris, says Quo. Yes, overconfidence, says Bertie. An autocratic management style, says Varun. That's a really interesting comment. Roger says, and Samuel as well, call it overconfidence. Spot on. And while they're still coming in, I actually want to pick up Varun's point about the autocratic management style, because so far we've very much focused on the decision-making risks in each of these situations. But actually each of these quadrants also poses very distinct risks to your perception as a leader. And absolutely on the bottom left, when you're paralyzed, you run the risk of being perceived as a follower, as a drifter, more than a decision maker, or as a leader, because you never take the big decisions. In the bottom right, when people feel you have sufficient knowledge to make a decision, but you don't, that's what we call the imposter syndrome, where people feel that maybe they shouldn't be in this leadership position, that someone made a mistake appointing them to the role of CEO or other leader. But yes, absolutely, here we have this risk of overconfidence or myopia, kind of short-sightedness, and not making use of all the information. As one of the CEOs put it, one of the most important things actually is having people around you that tell you how wrong you are. So how do we handle that? Well, we seek intellectual challenge. But importantly, that should not be confrontation, but challenge. So how do we make the sense of challenge playful, non-threatening, intellectually stimulating. And again, I'll pose the question to you, where have you seen it where either people have challenged you in a way to protect you against blind spots, to open your eyes to maybe things that you've overlooked? Where have you, some of your senior leaders, inviting a sense of challenge? How do you create this culture of challenge that people feel free to speak up? Again, if you want to share some of those examples, ask what people have missed, actually spelling out that question. It's like, okay, what am I not seeing here? And saying, okay, how can we create this challenge? Sometimes it's just a question of feeding people data to allow them to recognize that maybe their original decision wasn't the widest because there was a blind spot. Asking them, okay, and what's next? Ask that question often enough, and if you think if that initial decision sets you on a path that will lead you to a bad place, it's like, okay, let's imagine we make that decision, then what? And then what? And what next? And allow people to realize that sometimes they may have started from a wrong assumption early on. Anonymous surveys, absolutely, as Roger mentioned, it is also a question. Davina says, yeah, Obama is a great example, picking people like Hillary Clinton as people around them, so they can bring in this diversity of thought. Recently, very, very popular, this notion of so-called shadow boards. So you should have your board, and we know that, unfortunately, still typically dominated by white males, but have a shadow board that is actually the exact opposite of it. It's either very young people, people from NGOs, stakeholders, otherwise underrepresented groups, to make sure that you really harness this full diversity of thought in your organization and the community around it. Which brings us finally then, oh yes, to the example that I really like, and it's based here in Oxford basically. It's the example of Alice Stewart, and she is the protagonist of a very, very famous TED Talk, which I warmly recommend to you. It's Margaret Heffernan's TED Talk on Dare to Disagree. And Alice was a doctor here in Oxford, actually, in the 1950s, an epidemiologist. And she was very stuck with her research. And of course, as a scientist, to know that you actually know, the efforts you need to make are to falsify your theory. You need to seek out evidence that would actively contradict you. And so Alice hired this research assistant called George Neal, who was literally the exact opposite her in every possible way. She was very warm, very empathetic. She cared about her patients a lot, whereas George was just a pure numbers guy. And he said, look, I have one job and one job only, and that is to prove her wrong. Now, my question to you is, how often do we invite people in our lives into what Alice calls and what Margaret Heffernan calls these thinking partnership? And too often I hear about the term courageous conversations. We need to have kind of courageous conversation and call out people's blind spots. Personally, I think these are not courageous conversations. These are actually genuinely caring conversations. Because if we're perfectly honest with ourselves, very often we don't point out that someone might be about to make a bad decision. Not because we don't want to tell them, but because we don't want to make us uncomfortable in actually having that conversation. It's much easier to gloss over that, pat people on the back and say, sure, you go ahead and do that. It takes much more courage, but it is also much more caring to take the time to sit down. It's like, look, I'm not convinced this is the best decision. Let's talk this through. Let me be your devil's advocate, your critical friend, to help you protect against a serious blind spot here. As I said, I warmly recommend the TED Talk by Margaret Heffernan, Dare to Disagree, which tells the full story of Alice Stewart. Which obviously then brings us to the final quadrant, the top left of not knowing fearless leaders. And the question always, well, should these people exist in our organizations? Is there anything redeeming for those people? Is there a good reason why we should keep them around? So again, for a final time, I invite you to use the chat function both to talk about, okay, on the one hand, what can go wrong if you are in the very extreme, this kind of very edge on the top left of this framework, but also why would we want to retain these people and how can we make them actually useful for our organization? Okay, recklessness and irresponsibility, the danger of hubris, total failure. Yeah, that probably sums it up. They are not open to those caring conversations. Absolutely, they lack that humility to have that. But then, yes, they could be the real innovators. On the one hand, they could make very uninformed decisions, as Adriana says, but that is also the home of real innovation. As Michel kindly said in the introduction, I do work a lot with professionals. Very many are working on the management of risk. And when I do this exercise with them and they see that some of their colleagues identify with this quadrant and the top left, there are these kind of hushed whispers, and we talk about, I hear words like mavericks, cowboys, gunslingers shouldn't be here. And then typically it takes no longer than 60, maybe 90 seconds until someone puts up their hand and says, where would Elon Musk sit in all of this? And that's when people's perception of this quadrant really starts to change. So yes, the big risk is hubris. You bet the farm, you make decisions too quickly, you make big bets that are uninformed. And again, when we think about some of the big innovators that we admire, sometimes adore, a lot of them are actually entrepreneurs with a lot of private wealth who can make those kinds of decisions. But most of us work in organizations where we have a lot of responsibility for the organization, for the people around us, so probably we don't want to make those kinds of decisions, but maybe we want to come down just a little bit. So how do we make sure that we can remain fearless, we can remain innovative, and in a way, let's say, how can we rock the boat without sinking it? So again, the question, how can we make this quadrant productive? How can we get the best out of those people while also protecting our organization? How do we make this kind of absence of doubt productive? Okay, so there's a team approach to balance different risks. Intuition is an important role. Yes, risk management measures in place might be one. Keeping the customer at the center, so understanding who you're managing this for, absolutely. Okay, Divina mentions Apple, or generally the agility of just trying new things. Checks and balances, process control, says Bernardo, absolutely. So working off that, coming back to some of the examples that might spring to mind of leaders who've often been associated with hubris, but also great level of innovation. Again, think about Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, Steve Jobs, all of those. Over time, at least temporarily, if not permanently, all of them have been issued a sidekick to rein them in, install a little bit of process, whether it's Sheryl Sandberg with Mark Zuckerberg, Tim Cook, Steve Jobs. So yes, bringing in a little bit of process around it, a little bit of risk management, or running more agile approaches of kind of pilot, rolling out, fail fast, learn fast. Very often the generation of knowledge actually recognizes and requires some action. We need to do something to learn. But again, if you're not careful, you think you're indestructible, then that's where the dangers really lurk. So we want to protect against hubris by preparing for the possibility that we are wrong. But that does indeed require a level of hubris to acknowledge that this might actually be the case. And then, yes, manage risk through team approaches, scenario planning, worst case analysis, sensitivity testing, or kind of more agile approaches. And it is indeed the home of Also very literally, those who walk into the fire. Think about firefighters, elite police or military teams, or in fact, surgeons. I watched this documentary recently about surgeons on the cutting edge, and they interviewed a pediatric brain surgeon who had just come out of theater, performed one of these multi-hour miracles on a child's brain. And the reporter asked him, like, how do you do it? And he looked straight in the camera and said, pure arrogance. And I thought to myself, that's probably not what I would want to hear from my doctor. But then I reflected on this a little bit further, that it is not the kind of hubris where recklessness endangers a patient's life. There will be years and years of training, years and years of preparation for this particular moment, advice from a large team of experts, and every effort to minimize every possible risk. You do not want your surgeon to make the first cut with a trembling hand because they are anxious about what they might find once they cut. You want them to have the confidence, not the fearlessness, not the recklessness, but the confidence that they can manage the situation because they have prepared and managed those different risks. So collectively, this is the framework that we call the power of doubt. It identifies these different decision-making risks, and it allows you to have different conversations based on the different situation you find yourself in. Now, as I said before, if you're working in an organization where it is not okay to talk about anxiety, nervousness, even excitement, have a conversation about awareness, validation, challenge, or preparation. Talk about continuous learning, mentoring, diversity of thought, risk management. These are perfectly acceptable conversations to have in any organization. Build that connection from there. To summarize, doubts really humanize management. People today want leaders to be humans first and foremost. And they are to executives what nerves are to elite athletes. When we harness them, we make better decisions, we get better at our job, and paradoxically, they are a source of confidence and conviction. The better you doubt yourself, the more confidence in your decision, the more conviction in your communication. What this helps with, hopefully, is to avoid this stigma of insecurity. As I said, don't have conversations, if you can't, don't have conversations about doubt, insecurity, anxiety. Talk about learning, challenge, preparation, etc. The power of doubt also helps you outsource doubt. And that sounds maybe a bit weird. But what really makes doubt so debilitating is the need to have these two competing voices in your head. I need to make a confident decision, but I don't have sufficient information. I don't know what to do. And that is how often doubt spirals and becomes self-undermining. By understanding where you are in the landscape of doubt and understanding what kind of conversation you need to have, you can genuinely hand over one of these voices to somebody else and say, let's talk. And this is the kind of conversation I need you to bring to me right now. Finally, the power of doubt helps you build more meaningful relationships. On the one hand, by acknowledging the emotions that underpin our decisions, but also, once you understand better for yourself what kind of mechanisms help you overcome doubt, what kind of conversations you value in different situations, that also really helps you understand what kind of conversation you need to offer to somebody else who may be stuck in a moment of doubt. And that makes you a better trusted advisor, a better critical friend, and it helps you build more meaningful relationships. That is the framework of the power of doubt. Hopefully it illustrates to you how we bring research to life in the classroom, how we make it actionable in conversation with our students. As I said, we very much look forward to doing this with you live in person here in Oxford, or again digitally from September. I hope we have a few moments maybe for questions. I would look forward to them. If not, thank you very much for joining us today, and please get in touch with Misha and her team if you have any questions. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Michael. If we do want to just take a few extra minutes to answer any questions that might come in.
Okay, I think I'm just looking at some of the chat questions. So is one of the goals to be calm even when you lack knowledge? I think the point is more to have this calmness and confidence when you communicate your decision to others. I don't think it's our point to manipulate some of the emotions that we feel, but to acknowledge them, and even when they are uncomfortable, to acknowledge them as something productive. I wouldn't want you to feel calm in a situation when there is no reason to be calm. There needs to be sufficient energy to help with your decision making, but not too much energy to escalate into panic and kind of rash decision making. So in short, do we want people to always be calm? Not necessarily. We want them to understand their emotions and how they relate to their decision making and their knowledge seeking. Okay, Dhruv asks a very frequent question, how you react to different situations. Is that something that is by training, experience, or personality? Thank you very much for that. So we find that typically it is not personality. And you can probably look at your own experience and find various decisions in which you personally felt very different about the decision you had to make. What we do find in conversation with executives, and we've used this framework with several thousand by now, is that there is something about the nature of the decision or the nature of work that you do which possibly predisposes you more towards one type of doubt than the other. So the question to ask is, this disc, the landscape of doubt, is this flat or is it tilted towards one corner, for instance? To give you a quick example, if you are working in a highly entrepreneurial organizations that is very, very agile, it may well be that people are more predisposed and again celebrate the entrepreneurial spirit that some people may associate with hubris, and so the framework tilts there. If you work in a professional organization where you are mandated to be kind of right first time, it's much more likely that the whole framework will be tilted more towards anxiety, and that even when you think you know, you better double check, you better triple check, and so you may be more likely to drift towards the angst quadrant of the framework. So it's not necessarily the experience, but even the type of work you do in the moment. Okay, and I apologize. There are so many great questions, so I'm just picking up those that jump to my eye first. I apologize. I don't think I'm going in order. That is really nothing personal. There are lots of brilliant questions in here. There's the question about what if speed is of the essence? Absolutely, that's another scenario in which you're more likely to find yourself in that top left quadrant. You may find yourself in a situation of crisis where you simply have to act and you just don't have time to collect more data before you make your decision. And I actually think, ironically, that's the situation that we've been facing a lot around the current pandemic, where governments simply had to make decisions on isolation measures, investment in intensive care capacity, where they had to say, look, we don't know yet what is going to happen. There is certain modeling available, which may be imperfect, so we will do some things, and then we may step by step escalate those measures, but we will always be prepared, and we will hopefully communicate clearly that should new knowledge become available, as in scientists generate new data, we reserve the right to revise our decision. Because that's the other thing that's critical to crisis management, that you don't feel wedded to your decision, but you're wedded to being able to reassess whenever new data becomes available. Another question about, would you advise people to cultivate doubt, and how would you go about it? So one of the key things really, and the frame of that, it is difficult to cultivate doubt within yourself. The one thing you can do for yourself is accept it as something more positive than people have previously made it out to be. I mean, and there, I will be perfectly honest, there are still many executives out there who think that doubt is somewhat of a dirty word they would rather not use. So the first step is to accept it as something positive for yourself. But then it is really about this notion of outsourcing doubt and building a network, a community around you that helps you with all of these different quadrants. And again, the way to cultivate this productive doubt is to build a network of people around you who are very different, who can offer you this diversity of thought, but also who can offer you a very different conversation depending on the situation you find yourself in, so that you actually have access to different perspectives and different worldviews. Okay, I'm quickly calling out to Misha as well. I know that you've been keeping an eye on the chat. Is there anything I've missed?
I think you've done a good sort of sweep of the key themes and the questions that have come up. So just kind of aware of time. We do still have quite a few attendees on the chat. I don't know if there's anything else that jumps out to you, or we can go ahead and wrap it up at this point.
I'm just going to the list, and I will just again say I've just taken questions as they came in and jumped to my eye. Someone asked, Kayuan asked, is it a bad thing to shut off emotions and in decision making? The key question again is, like, we know since the research of Kahneman and Tversky that our brain is simply hardwired to actually tap into emotions before it taps into data and knowledge. So it's physically impossible to cut out emotions. So we probably shouldn't try it. What we need to do is acknowledge emotions, understand how they affect our decision making, and then take steps and measures to de-bias our decision making. Emotions will always be in there. We then have to understand how we can harness them.
Do you want to answer maybe one or two more questions if you see them?
Yeah, so there's some questions obviously around the current situation, creating assurance in a team. And I think that the one thing that's particularly important at these times is this risk that some people simply like to pretend that they have all the answers. And even before the pandemic hit, in a much more stable world, the respondents in our study said, look, the one surefire way to spot a fraud these days is anyone who walks into your office and says that they have all the answers and they have all the knowledge, because that is just effectively impossible in a world that moves as fast as ours does today. The key question is being very clear about what you know, what you think you know, as in what are the assumptions you're making, but also being very clear about what is not known and how you're going to fill that gap. And that moves you into a position where you can hold a team, which is giving them assurance in the present without making any wild promises about the future, which you can't know that. Give people reassurance that I'm very clear about what is known and what is not known, and I'm very clear what we're going to do about it so we can move forward. The key reassurance your team needs is that you're not shooting blind in the dark in this kind of fearless, not knowing way without any preparation, and you're not just guessing. That's the key reassurance people want in these particular times. And then some people also speculate or suggest, and I agree, that especially in times like these, it might be particularly beneficial to articulate some doubts because it simply makes us more human. I think that's really the one thing we've learned in the time of social distancing, that human connection, especially when we're not near to each other, is becoming so much more important. If you look at a lot of the corporate communication, it's no longer about transmitting information, transmitting knowledge, but it's all about building human connection. And as you yourself discovered and commented at the beginning of the session, acknowledging these emotions and articulating more of these doubts and how we're going to make them productive actually gives us a lot more human connection with the people we're trying to lead and influence and care for.
Perfect. Okay, well, on that note then, I think I'll wrap the session up here. So Michael, thank you very much for that thought-provoking interactive session, the framework on the power of doubt, and then weaving in different examples of companies and leaders, and the current situation was extremely relevant. And I think we can tell from the chat group and all of the questions from our attendees that a lot of people had some relevant comments, and it was a great session for all. So thank you for your time. I appreciate that. And thank you for everyone for tuning in. As Sam has typed in the chat box, if you have any questions at all about the MBA application, the program itself, anything specific to admissions or recruitment, please get in touch with our office and we will be able to set up an advising appointment to address your concerns. So again, Michael, thank you so much for your time, and I hope to hear from various attendees after the session.
Okay.